Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This is Tracy Berardi, Program Manager of the Cloud Standards Customer Council, here with Dan O'Prey, Chair of the Hyperledger Marketing Committee and CMO at Digital Asset, and Tracy Kuhrt, Community Architect at Hyperledger with the Linux Foundation. Very excited they could join us today to provide an update on Hyperledger, which is the Linux Foundation's blockchain project, open source project. Looks like folks are joining now. I'd like to point your attention, in the attachments tab, we've included a download of the presentation if you'd like to take that with you. And also there's a link to the Hyperledger website. There's some resources on there for you to check out if you'd like to get involved. The presentation will be about 40-45 minutes, give or take, and we'd like to take some questions at the end. So if you'd like to submit questions during the presentation, you can enter those in the questions tab here on Bright Talk, and we'll address those towards the end. But Dan, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Tracy, and thank you to the CSCC for hosting us to talk about Hyperledger today. So as Tracy mentioned, my name is Dan O'Prey. I'm the chair of the marketing committee at Hyperledger. Lucky enough to be serving in my second term there. And I'm also, my day job, one of the premier members of Hyperledger called Digital Asset, where I'm the chief marketing officer. So we're a blockchain-based startup based in New York City who primarily serves financial services applications. So just quickly a little bit about the Hyperledger Marketing Committee. This is a group that is open to all premier members and general members, so any member of Hyperledger to participate in. And really it's all the business of marketing open source blockchain technologies across events, PR, and all the other various channels. So it's a great community of lots of different marketing professionals from all the different member organizations. So if you are a Hyperledger member or looking to become one, I encourage you to get involved in our marketing activities. I'm going to hand over to Tracy Kuhrt.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Tracy, for having us. So my name is Tracy Kuhrt, and I'm the community architect at Hyperledger. So as a community architect, my role is to help people get involved with our technical communities and the different projects that we have within the Hyperledger umbrella. So I also look at the overall technical strategy that we have within Hyperledger to ensure that what we're doing makes sense to both the people who are using the projects as well as to the people who are contributing to those different projects. So in today's webinar, this is the agenda that we're going to cover. We're going to give you an introduction to Hyperledger and the different projects that exist. We're going to talk about what the big deal is with business blockchain. We're going to look at the unique features of our two projects that have reached the 1.0 milestone, Hyperledger Fabric and Hyperledger Sawtooth. And then we'll close with a couple of slides on how you might get involved with Hyperledger. So let's start by looking at the Linux Foundation. So the Linux Foundation is a nonprofit that hosts Hyperledger as a collaborative project. So for those of you who don't know, the Linux Foundation was originally created in 2000 to provide a home for the Linux operating system. So the Linux Foundation has taken that experience that they've had with building up the Linux community and extending its work to more than just Linux. So today it's looking at every layer of the software stack and has a number of different projects that span enterprise IT, embedded systems, consumer electronics, cloud, networking, and more. So on this page, you can see a few of those different projects that we have within the Linux Foundation. The first one is under security. It's called Let's Encrypt. It's a free, automated, and open certificate authority. The second one that we have is called Open Network Automation Platform. It's ONAP for short, and it provides real-time, policy-driven software automation of virtual network functions. The next one is Kubernetes, which is a cloud-native computing foundation project, and it provides production-grade container orchestration. Then we have the automotive-grade Linux, which is an open software platform to develop automotive applications. The Node.js Foundation is working on building and supporting the Node.js platform. And then, of course, the reason that we're here today is to talk about the blockchain project that we have within the Linux Foundation called Hyperledger. So Hyperledger is the fastest growing project that has been hosted by the Linux Foundation. It currently has more than 185 members, and the project was first announced with 30 members back in February of 2016. Actually, tomorrow is the 2-year kind of birth date of Hyperledger, so just an interesting fact there. Hyperledger membership is really global. So we have 39% of our members that are in APAC, with 25% of those being in China. We have 20% in EMEA and 41% that's spread across North America. So our membership, besides spanning the globe, also spans a number of industries, including finance, banking, the Internet of Things, supply chain, manufacturing, healthcare, and technology. So in Hyperledger, we have what we call a modular umbrella approach. So we have a number of different projects that exist within Hyperledger. So as I mentioned, right, Hyperledger is a collaborative project that's under the Linux Foundation. We provide really a neutral home for collaboration, as well as providing that infrastructure for things like legal services, marketing and PR, developer and vendor coordination, and community development and advocacy. So Hyperledger incubates a range of different sorts of business blockchain technologies, including distributed ledger frameworks, smart contract engines, client libraries, development and operation tools, as well as sample applications. And so you can see a number of those projects are listed here, right? We have 9 open source projects currently under the Hyperledger umbrella. We have 6 that are in incubation and 3 that have graduated to an active status. So the 3 that have graduated to an active status are Hyperledger Fabric, Hyperledger Sawtooth, and Hyperledger Aloha. And then, as I mentioned, right, the 2 that are in 1.0 we'll talk about later are Hyperledger Fabric and Hyperledger Sawtooth. So the remaining projects that we have, Indie, Burrow, Composer, Cello, Explorer, and Quilt, are still in incubation. And that just means that those communities are still being built, and the processes for releases and developing roadmaps are being created. So these are obviously any of these projects anybody can get involved in and be part of. But you know, we do make sure that the community is actually a vibrant community before we move them to an active state. So I could spend like the whole hour talking about this slide in general. I've done it. People may not be aware of that exist within the Hyperledger umbrella. The first one of those is Hyperledger Indie. It's focused on identity rooted on the blockchain. So specifically, it's focused on self-sovereign identity, which allows us as individuals to take back ownership of our personal information. So this is done via verifiable claims that utilize zero-knowledge proofs to provide information about ourselves without providing the underlying data behind that. So a typical example that I use is today when I enter a bar in the United States, I have to prove that I'm over 21. I do this by handing over my driver's license, which not only has my birth date on it, but also my name and address and other information that's not really required to enter that bar. So a verifiable claim would allow me to provide an attestation to the bar that can be verified without having to have access to my birth date, let alone any of those other pieces of information that exist on my driver's license. The second project I want to talk about on this slide is Hyperledger Composer. So Hyperledger Composer is a suite of tools that allows you to quickly model your business blockchain network. And it does that using a modeling language that any business person can utilize. So it allows you to model the participants, the assets, and the transactions that are part of your business network. And since this is business friendly, it doesn't require an actual developer to create this model. The only point where you actually need a developer would be to implement the underlying transaction logic. And this allows for your business people and your developers to work hand in hand together to define your business blockchain network. In addition to this modeling language, it also will generate a REST API from that model. And that allows your existing developers who may not know anything about blockchain to actually start using and writing blockchain applications. So this is really a great tool for quickly bringing up a proof of concept if you have an idea that you want to model and put together an application for. So as I said, right, I could talk about each of these in very deep detail. I just don't have the time today to do that. If anybody's interested, I'm always happy to spend time with people and talk through those. So yeah, let's see. I guess now I'll hand it over to Dan, and Dan can kind of walk through what blockchain technologies are.
Thanks, Tracy. So yeah, quick 101 for those of you who aren't familiar with the space. I won't belabor this too much for those of you who are. But generally speaking, what is a distributed ledger? It's often conflated with or used as an equivalent to blockchain, but there is a bit of a difference there. So a blockchain is an ordered set of blocks, so essentially an ordered log that's tamper resistant, that links links events, usually transactions, to prior events that have happened. So you end up with an append-only system with an immutable log of proofs that you can look back on and make sure that the current state is valid, and that multiple parties can rely on looking at the current state to know where they are in that process. In case of cryptocurrencies, which we'll touch on slightly later, this is purely about do you have the account balance and moving tokens between accounts and having a log of those accounts and being able to validate that at all times. So a blockchain is one way to create a distributed ledger. There are distributed ledgers out there that don't actually use a blockchain at all. They do use cryptography. So in the same way that each block has a header which has a cryptographic hash of the previous block, you can use cryptographic chains almost to create distributed ledgers which don't rely on an underlying actual blockchain. So really it's, to put it simply, any scenario in which multiple parties need to hold local copies or independent copies of the same data that they rely upon across organizations need to be kept in sync so that everybody knows which step they're at. So if there's a need to synchronize data securely and privately across organizations, a blockchain or a distributed ledger may be a good use case, a good fit for solving that. So that's about how you keep data in sync, but of course in order to keep data in sync you have to agree on how you'll be able to update that data. So that's where smart contracts come in. Smart contracts are essentially programs that run either on the blockchain or on top of a blockchain by multiple parties so that they can independently verify the processes of updating the data. So you think of blockchain as what do we know to be true today? A smart contract is what are the rules that we can all agree upon or to enforce that will lead to the changing of the data that we agree upon today. So it's quite hard to give a all-encompassing definition of smart contracts. It still does, as a term, mean different things to different people, and in fact predates the existence of blockchains by at least a decade. But a good example, or a simple example from the original definition from Nick Szabo was just thinking of a vending machine. By entering in money, you put in an input, coins, you select the output, and it automatically enforces that contractual relationship or that agreement between you and the vending machine to deliver the can of Coke. Of course, there are much more complex business processes that run across many different organizations, where some organizations need to see subsets of those different flows and authorize those. And that's really where the real power of smart contracts comes in. So just a quick one, so cryptocurrencies are always a great example of blockchain, and they were Bitcoin was the first implementation of a blockchain, but blockchain does not mean cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrencies use blockchains. Many other different applications also use blockchains. So a cryptocurrency is one of N numbers of ways to use a blockchain and one of the benefits of it. So you don't necessarily have to have a native token built in, like Bitcoin or like Ether in Ethereum. In fact, Hyperledger Fabric, Hyperledger Sawtooth do not have a native cryptocurrency. It's just one use of many. But of course, you can use things like Composer or Fabric or Sawtooth directly to create tokens of value, whether they're cryptocurrencies or digitized traditional assets. So why business blockchain technologies and why create Hyperledger in the first place? Really the scope of different applications that this technology applies to is quite large. As I said, any data that needs to be synchronized across parties, where you can't just rely on a single trusted, say cloud provider to share that data. So you can have if you think of a sort of a logical Venn diagram of overlapping circles where there are data in different sections, they need to be seen by different parties, but not shared across everybody. So it really applies to financial services, which is the area that we're focused on at Digital Asset, but supply chain, healthcare, almost any business that interacts with other companies in their space and has to keep local books and records over the activities that they're participating in. And why create Hyperledger? Well, so as you've just heard, Hyperledger is 2 years old tomorrow, and 2 years ago, really, the space was still very much focused on the cryptocurrency aspect of it, the public permissionless meaning anyone can participate in the mining or transaction validation or actual transacting process. The current state of those were very much optimized for those specific use cases. When you're dealing with known enterprises who have physical locations and have to comply with local laws, a lot of the technological design trade-offs that were made in order to achieve the public chain applications, which are usually required to fit that requirement, under a different requirement, you would design very, very differently. And in the world of global commerce, the requirements are substantially different. And so Hyperledger was formed by a group of 30 companies to start with, to really look at how can we apply this technology to the enterprise space in a way that complies with regulations and a way that actually facilitates existing businesses, rather than purely trying to make a peer-to-peer electronic cash. So now, what's the big deal? I've mentioned a few different industries. I'm now going to highlight some of the applications that people have actually been using Hyperledger technologies to solve their real-world business problems. This is just going to cover 3. There's actually many, many more. If you go to hyperledger.org and click on the Industries tab, there's currently a tracker for all the different use cases within financial services, all the POCs that are going on, and we're expanding that to healthcare and other industries as well. So you can see really the breadth of different applications that this technology is suitable for. But just to give you a flavor of those and highlight 3 of some of the big projects. Within financial services, cross-border payments is a huge, has many challenges. I'm sure many of you will have sent money internationally. It relies on what's called a correspondent banking network, which is essentially a series of hops between banks with different relationships with other banks. Not all banks have direct relationships, which requires local Nostra and Vostra accounts. So you have to hop around the network to try and find a path from one bank, that customer who's sending the money from to the other bank of the person who's receiving the funds. And this is extremely complicated and can often lead to people not actually even having visibility into where in the process the transfer is. So they'll tell you it takes 3 to 5 days, and it's because the bank that is sending the funds, once it's left their account at their correspondent bank, they don't actually have visibility into where in that hop process it is, or how many hops there will be until it arrives. So it's quite a large coordination problem. It's also exacerbated by the fact that there are several distinct networks for payments. In the United States alone, you have several layers from the Fedwire to ACH to even up to PayPal or other money transmission businesses. So coordinating between different geographies as global finance, global economy becomes more and more vital. It becomes quite technologically challenging. So SWIFT, who many of you will have heard of if you've done that SWIFT code to make that international payment, ANZ, Australia New Zealand Bank, Wells Fargo, BNY Mellon, and BNP Paribas, some of the largest banks in the world and the largest consortium of banks in the world, SWIFT, which has over 10,000 banks, got together to do a proof of concept on Hyperledger Fabric to support the governance, maintain the privacy, which is obviously key, standardization, and identity, which we touched on, but know your customer, know who's actually sending it, and get that real-time visibility into accounts to prevent the need for reconciliation at the end of the day, where different banks have different accounts of what has happened and they have to reconcile their books and records to get onto the same page. There's also several other risks in the system around the exchange rate moving and things like that. So not to dwell on this one too much, but yeah, very complex and being tackled by several of the Hyperledger members. Looking to a different industry, healthcare is obviously faces a lot of the similar challenges, particularly around privacy, sharing confidential data records. Again, the experience of going to a hospital and your doctor has his record somewhere, and then you go to a specialist who has their X-ray on stored somewhere else. It can often be all the relevant data that applies to you is you don't own that, well you can't track that, and it can be very hard and time-consuming to make sure that people are looking at the most up-to-date records. So Change Healthcare, who are one of the biggest healthcare clearing providers in the US, a startup called GEM and Hashed Health, as well as big insurance company like Kaiser Permanente and tech company Patientori, got together to try and synchronize the needs of health records across multiple different entities, whilst ensuring that you keep that data private. So you can actually just share it. When you look at the X-ray, you can check it against the evidence on the blockchain to see, okay, this is the most up-to-date X-ray. It was performed at this time. It was done by that party, and you have greater visibility into your data and ability to mediate who needs to see which records. Lastly, digital identity. This is a huge one. Tracy's already mentioned Hyperledger Indy, which is looking at self-sovereign identity. So really the idea of not just improving digital identity generally, but putting it back in the hands of the people that it belongs to. So rather than you having an identity at this bank and an identity at this school, et cetera, you have one identity you control, and you selectively reveal those pieces of information, as Tracy said with the bar example. So the example here, one of Hyperledger's members, Amihan, is tackling, together with the Bankers Association of the Philippines, are working on providing that digital identity to allow more Filipinos to have access to bank accounts. Currently, only 44% have accounts. It's quite hard to verify personal information, particularly in developing countries, to know that it's accurate. And then that process of having to do that again and again when you apply for a passport, when you open a bank, when you apply for a credit card, it can help streamline that process by providing an on-chain identity that you can then reuse for multiple different purposes. And people can validate, as Tracy said, without even knowing the specifics of things they don't need to know. just getting a true or false answer is often all that's required for a lot of questions. So this streamlines onboarding of new accounts and allows customers to enter that information once, preserve their privacy, and reuse that data again and again. And they're looking to expand this beyond the proof of concept to potentially a nationwide self-sovereign ID system. So quite an exciting use amongst a lot of different applications for digital identity. And handing back to Tracy Kuhrt to talk about Hyperledger Fabric and Hyperledger Sawtooth, which recently went to 1.0.
Great, thanks. So yeah, as Dan mentioned, right, these are our first two projects that have hit kind of that 1.0 milestone. The 1.0 milestone is really a signal from the developers in the community to users of those projects that the software is ready for production use cases. And so we'll start by looking at kind of Hyperledger Fabric. So Hyperledger Fabric was released as a 1.0 back in July of this year. And, you know, there's this being kind of the first project that was contributed to Hyperledger. It's, you know, the first one to reach 1.0. It's kind of the granddaddy of what we have in the projects of Hyperledger. And, you know, this particular framework that we have with Hyperledger Fabric provides for smart contracts that are called chain code. Chain code is in the 1.0 written in Go language. And with the 1.1 release, chain code will also be able to be written in JavaScript. But one of the major features that Hyperledger Fabric brings is a concept called channels. And channels are really a way to make sure that information shared between two or more network members can be private, right? So that private and confidential transactions can occur on a larger network. And only the network members that are part of that channel can see those particular transactions. And now the community is currently working on their 1.1 release. It's currently in an alpha state, and some of the features that are included in this 1.1 release include Node.js chain code. So as I mentioned, right, with 1.0 you could only create Golang chain code. With the 1.1 release, you'll also be able to write your smart contracts in JavaScript. They're also providing an encryption library that will allow you to encrypt sensitive data that a chain code processes and updates. There's also attribute-based access control, and this allows you to use attributes that are inside of the Fabric CA generated certificates, so those X.509 certificates, to control access within your chain code functions to who has the ability to do what. There's also a number of performance improvements that have been made with the 1.1 release, including improvements to the order, identity caching, parallel transaction validation, as well as CouchDB performance improvements. So in addition to these kind of high-level features that are part of 1.1, there's also a number of experimental features that are included in the source code. And these experimental features can be enabled if you build from the actual source using an experimental compile flag. And so some of these experimental features that may be of interest are Java chain code. So as you can see, right, the Fabric community feels it's really important to support a number of different languages with chain code. So we started with Golang, we added JavaScript, and we're going to be also adding Java as well. The next one is resource-based access control that allows you to have finer-grained access control to limit who can invoke the chain code, who can retrieve blocks, who can retrieve transactions, amongst other sorts of access control that might be needed. And then the last one that's listed here is called private channel data. And this is really a way to keep data on a channel private. So today, all data is shared with the ordering service. With this private channel data, the data will never be sent to the ordering service with the transaction. Instead, that private data is shared only with a subset of the peers that is governed by different policies and the gossip protocol. So then the second one that we have is Hyperledger Sawtooth. This is our second project that was contributed to Hyperledger, and it's also the second project to reach the 1.0 milestone. So, you know, as you can see, we're starting to see that these different communities are reaching 1.0. They're feeling comfortable with what they've created, and hoping that people will start to use these projects. So within Hyperledger feature, there's actually a number of interesting features. Within Hyperledger Sawtooth, there's a number of interesting features that are part of it. The first one is called unpluggable or dynamic consensus. So this allows you to, via a transaction that will be stored on your chain, change which sort of consensus mechanism is being utilized by your network. So this may be useful if you've started up with a proof of concept and you've decided that this proof of concept is actually working well, and you want to change the consensus mechanism that's being used. This unpluggable consensus will allow you to do that without having to restart the entire network. The second feature that is unique about Hyperledger Sawtooth is the proof of elapsed time consensus mechanism. And so proof of elapsed time, it utilizes the secure enclave on the Intel chips to mimic the proof of work algorithm. So for those of you who don't know, the proof of work algorithm is what Bitcoin uses to do consensus, but it uses a large amount of energy, right? There's a high energy consumption that's required by proof of work. With POET, it doesn't require that high energy consumption, because what it does is it provides a random wait timer to the different validators or nodes that are on the network. And the first validator whose random wait timer expires will generate the next block that's on the blockchain. So this allows for very scalable sorts of network sizes, right? That maybe a PBFT sort of consensus mechanism wouldn't allow. Also, they allow you to write your smart contracts in a number of different languages. So you can write them in C, C++, JavaScript, Go, Java, and Python. And I was just on their tech forum today, and they were talking about the support for Rust language as well. So they really thought that that was something that they should focus on immediately, as far as making sure that any developer could come in and write some contracts for Hyperledger Sawtooth. Hyperledger Sawtooth community and the Hyperledger Burrow community came together in one of our past hackathons that we had this last year to bring the Ethereum virtual machine as a transaction family into Sawtooth. So what we see with this umbrella approach that we're taking is that these communities are coming together, sharing knowledge and technology, and bringing those different features to the different projects that we have. So what this really means is that you can now, if you've started with Ethereum, bring your Solidity contracts to Hyperledger Sawtooth and run those as part of the Ethereum virtual machine transaction family that they have. You can also run them obviously in Hyperledger Burrow, right, which was the first permissioned Ethereum virtual machine. It just uses a different sort of consensus mechanism. The next thing that they do is they have a supply chain example that you can use out of the box. And this supply chain example does a couple of things. It allows you to track the provenance of goods, and it allows you to do telemetry sort of tracking. So this could be interesting if you're looking at maybe IoT and you want to see maybe how that works. This supply chain example could be a good place to start. And then the last thing that the Hyperledger Sawtooth community has added is parallel transaction execution, making sure that you can do transactions in parallel instead of running those transactions serially. So this obviously adds additional throughput to your network, which is obviously something that we all want to have. So then the last thing that I want to talk about today in the agenda is really how you might get involved. What are things that you can do to either learn about what we're doing within Hyperledger or to come into the community and start to participate. So the first thing that I'll talk about is a free online course that we created within the Linux Foundation that we offer on edX.org. So this course was designed with both business and technical people in mind, and it starts by providing an introduction to blockchain technologies. Obviously goes in deeper than what we covered here. It introduces Hyperledger and the different projects, so it will actually talk about all of the projects instead of just the few that I highlighted. It will look at a number of different use cases, including more than just what Dan shared with you. And then it starts digging into the technical material. It looks at the architecture for our 3 active projects, Hyperledger Roha, Hyperledger Fabric, and Hyperledger Sawtooth. And it will get you up and running with an instance of Hyperledger Fabric and Hyperledger Sawtooth, as well as walk you through an example of how you might create a blockchain application. So it's really a good place to start. We currently have over 70,000 people enrolled in that course, and so it's obviously a topic that is interesting to a lot of people. And then lastly, I just want to talk about the different ways that you can get involved. So because Hyperledger is an open source community, anybody can get involved in any of the projects. There's a number of different ways that we have for communicating. We offer both mailing list as well as Rocket Chat, which is an open source Slack alternative. And so we have mailing lists and chat channels for each of our different projects as well as each of our different working groups. We offer a number of different events that you can see on the Hyperledger org site. The one that could be of interest is we have a bi-monthly Hackfest. So every other month we get the core developers together with other interested members of the community to discuss the different projects and work on new ideas that people might have for these different projects. And our next Hackfest is actually next week in LA. I think we're really close to a limit as far as the number of people, but there may be still a few openings if anybody's interested in joining us in LA. And then we have 85 different meetups that exist across the world that are focused on Hyperledger. And these different meetups, you know, if there's a meetup not in your area and you'd really like to host one, then definitely reach out to us and let us know, and we can help you get started with that. We have a number of different working groups, as I mentioned, that are focused on really a wide variety of topics. So we focus in on looking at use cases, we look at the architecture of our different projects, identity, and training and education, and there's obviously others as well. We have a performance and scale working group. But all of those working groups are open to anybody who wants to join. We have a public calendar so you can see when those meetings occur. We record all of our meetings so that if it's not at a time that's friendly to you, or you're on vacation, or you just happen to miss the meeting, you can come back and catch up on what's been happening. And of course, all of our source code is open source, so you can download and use any of the projects that you want. And yeah, I hope to see you kind of joining our community and getting involved. And with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us today, and maybe open up to see if we have any questions.
Great. Thanks, Tracy. It's the other Tracy. And thank you, Dan. We do have a few questions in the queue, and now's a good time if you have one lingering that you want to enter. So Dan and Tracy, first question that came in was, can you talk about opportunities for charities and other nonprofits to learn and grow with the technology?
Sure. So this is Dan. So there's several different ways for companies and organizations to get involved. There is Premier membership, which entitles you to a board seat and voting participation on the marketing committee. It doesn't give you any special treatment on the technical steering committee, which is purely a meritocracy. There's general memberships for smaller companies and different pricing tiers. But to answer that question, there is an associate membership. So if you go to hyperledger.org and click under the members tab, there's join Hyperledger. There's actually a completely free tier for pre-approved nonprofits, open source projects, and government entities. So there's already many central banks like Bank of England and the Federal Reserve of Boston who are members. open source foundations like Distributed Identity Foundation and several others. So that's a great way to really, to become a member, which means you can participate in all of the marketing committee calls and events and join in the technical community and really keep up to date with everything that's going on in all things Hyperledger.
Thanks, Dan. Excuse me. The next question, I think, is referring back to this course. I'm going to bring up the slide asking if this course will be updated or are you due to release the next level course in this at some point?
Yeah, sure, I can take that. So this is Tracy. So we are working on updating the course. When we created this course, Sawtooth 1.0 was not available, and we based it on 0.8 of Hyperledger Sawtooth. So we're looking at making sure that we update this course to reflect kind of the 1.0 nature of Hyperledger Sawtooth. And then in addition, we are looking at kind of what the next courses are, right? So should we provide deep dives into Fabric or Sawtooth, or maybe Indy or Composer? And we do have, just kicking off, is a training and education working group that we invite you to join, right? And so this training and education working group is going to be looking at what are the particular topics that people are interested in kind of digging into, kind of what are those next level courses, and then developing the material surrounding those ideas and those courses. So all of this is going to be done in an open source manner. So anything that we develop will be able to be used by other people in the community, either for just training themselves, or maybe a university or a college is interested in offering a blockchain course. This stuff is going to be open for other people to use. So definitely something that I recommend that you get involved in. And we do have, as I mentioned, right, a mailing list for the training and education working group, and we do have a Rocket Chat channel. There's currently a doodle poll that's out there asking for what is the best time to meet. So if you're interested, highly recommend getting yourself part of that doodle poll to put your thoughts in. So yeah, thanks for that question.
Great, that sounds good. And I'll give you a second here to check out the questions that have come in. We got a few at once. Let's see. A quick question here. What is the scope of Hyperledger in the telecom industry? Tracy or Dan, if you have any perspective you could share there.
Yes, so I'm not that close to the telecom industry. I know there are large members like Huawei and others who are equipment providers to that industry who are members. There has been interest and exploration around some of the issues in the roaming market. I know the GSMA, the primary association for mobile operators, have been looking into this space and have released a couple of papers. So issues around, similar to the correspondent banking example earlier, of different, when you roam onto different geographies or on different networks, there are payments that have to be recorded and paid back and cleared and settled, and similar to the financial services world. So around roamings of interest, and of course mobile payments as well. But that's as much as I know. Check out the GSMA paper, I think is quite interesting.
Great. Anything you would add there, Tracy, or we can go on to the next question?
Yeah, I think we can go on.
Okay. This question, the identity in a blockchain is a great idea, digital identity, but how do you avoid impersonation? What if an individual shares his access token with another? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is very similar to what we have today, right, with identities. If you share your password with others, then they can obviously use your account to do things, right? I think it becomes even worse if you start to share your keys, your keys with others to kind of unlock the data that's behind you, right? So it is definitely not something that you want to do. The community is really looking at kind of identity wallets, right? So that you have control of that wallet and a control of those keys. But yeah, just like any sort of identity, it's if you share information about yourself, like those passwords or those keys, then others have access to everything that you have access to.
I don't have too much more to add to that other than you look at some of the work that's being done in Estonia and also by one of the members, Guard Time. Estonia has really been at the forefront of leading digital identity with their global citizenship. I think it's called e-residence program. So just a suggestion to look towards that to find out more information.
Thank you. Have we seen any use of blockchain to validate the pedigree of social media data being consumed or analyzed by data scientists?
So I don't know that I've seen any specific use cases of this. I do know that there are people who are looking at, and actually there's I think a podcast out there somewhere where Brian Dellendorf, our executive director, talks about how do we prevent kind of the fake news, right, from expanding into the world, and but I don't know of anybody who's actually done that yet. The one thing that I would kind of mention though is that there are definitely people who are looking at things like certification, right, and being able to certify that maybe you went to a particular college or you had a particular job and those sorts of things. And I think those are the sorts of things that while not related specifically to social media, will definitely be a use case that people are interested in pursuing, right? As it's something that I hear from a number of different people as they look at blockchain.
Yeah, one of the great things about open source software is we don't know what everyone's doing with it, right? So lots of people are just pulling it from GitHub and going out and building projects, and then we discover those at Hackfests or elsewhere. So I highly recommend jumping on the mailing list and joining Rocket Chat and asking around, because there could well be someone else out there we're not aware of directly.
This next question is sort of in the same line. Is Zell Financial Consortium, do you know if they're using Hyperledger blockchain for their project?
I'm not familiar with that entity, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I'm not either. Now they, like Dan said, right, they very well may have downloaded the code and are using it, and we just don't know about it. But yeah, I'm not specifically aware one way or the other. Okay.
Yeah, no problem. Just thought I would ask in case. And we're getting down to the last two here. Can a mainframe and small computer exist as blockchain peers in Sawtooth?
So that's a good question that I'm not sure that I have a really good answer for. I will tell you that we currently have Docker containers for Sawtooth, as well as Debian packages, and we also, maybe I should have said RPM, Red Hat Package Manager, I believe is actually what actually exists. So I've installed it on Ubuntu using that package manager. And then Sawtooth also works in AWS, right? So there are a number of different ways. Now, obviously, somebody wanted us to repeat that question. The question was, can a mainframe or a small computer be used as a Sawtooth peer? Sorry, I got distracted. But yeah, there's definitely a number of ways that you can install Sawtooth, and then of course, we can always look at, since it is open source, building that software for a different architecture, right? Be it maybe a Raspberry Pi or a mainframe sort of environment. So it's definitely possible, but I'm not aware of anything that is running Sawtooth.
Last question here. When there are multiple parties, each having a copy of the chain, how do you maintain synchronization as different parties may only get the data at different points in time? Is a transaction only possible when all parties have the data and approve?
Yeah, so this is really looking at those different consensus mechanisms, right, that exist out there. In most of our blockchain frameworks, we use some sort of gossip protocol, usually a gRPC, to gossip among the different peers that are part of a blockchain network. And depending on the consensus mechanism, right, it could be that a number of peers have to approve that transaction before it can actually be committed to the blockchain network, right? So in the case of Hyperledger Fabric, the process is that you endorse a transaction, and that endorsement could be whatever you specify. It could be like 3 out of 5 of the peers have to do it. It may be either this peer or that peer has to do it. It could be either this peer or these 2 other peers both have to approve it, right? So there's different endorsement policies that you can specify with Hyperledger Fabric. And then once those transactions are endorsed, they get ordered via the ordering service, and then they get committed as those transactions, right? So based on the order. So people tend to ask me, well, what happens if 2 transactions are kind of dependent on each other? They change the same asset. So what happens is that the first one gets committed. If the read set of is still valid, right? What they read initially when it was endorsed is still valid, then it will write that transaction. And then when that second transaction comes in, the read set will have changed because that first transaction will have modified what was stored in the actual ledger, and it will be rejected. So those transactions will either be marked as accepted or rejected inside of the block itself. Now, in the case of, say, the proof of elapsed time sort of consensus mechanism, right, the idea is that the first validator whose wait timer expires gets to generate the next block. And so once that block gets generated, it then will propagate that information to the other peers that are part of the network. So very similar in the way that they're handling the propagation of information, but maybe slightly different based on which consensus mechanism is being used.
Thank you, Tracy, for that good explanation. It looks like we answered all the questions, which is great. Any follow-on questions, feel free if you'd like to send me a note, tracy@omg.org. I'm sure Dan and Tracy would be happy to chat with me afterwards, and we can help you out. And again, in the attachments tab, there's a PDF copy of the presentation and a link to hyperledger.org. Dan, Tracy, thank you so much for your time this afternoon, and for everyone that tuned in. I hope you have a great rest of the day, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.